Hey students, hey. I feel like I'm increasingly looking worse every day that you get me, but here I am. I want to lecture to you on this chapter 11, which is an interesting combination actually of ADHD and then this huge category of other health disorders that are related to physical impairments. So we'll first talk about the ADHD, and then I'll figure out whether to stop the clip and make a second recording with the health impairments. That's probably how I'll do this. I've also been really careful this time to integrate and find YouTube videos that I will direct you to as we go along. So I'm trying to integrate those more in the lecture as if we were sitting in a classroom together, and I might stop the lecture and then play something so that we can see it and have some commentary about it. So I hope you'll do that as I point those out to you. I've had a nice time finding ones that I thought were good fits for this whole area that we're talking about. So getting on to the business of what we're trying to do, I want to talk a little bit about just some introductory ideas about ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's been interesting for me to revisit this topic and read modern commentary and research on it, because my husband has a son. His name is Avery, and he is in his early 40s, and he has ADHD. And so as I was reading this material and thinking and understanding new ways of looking at it and treating it, it took me back 25 years to 30 years, really, 35 years, to when little Avery was a boy, 5, 6, 7 years old, and we were making decisions about medication, no medication, and watching his peer relationships and all kinds of factors related to that. So, and you probably know or have known students and friends or even family members who have ADHD. So this is the sort of introductory notes to that lecture. Historically, it's interesting to understand that ADHD has been something that has existed for a long time, and that people noticed in terms of people's attention or their super hyperactive physical motor actions. And in the textbook, I think they cite a research study or a writer or someone who wrote about this disorder, and that was in the early 1900s. And when you think about behavior and expectations for children in the 1900s, it's important really to understand that children at that time were thought to be just almost like miniature adults. There was not a lot of, even children's literature wasn't playful for children in the 1900s. Storybooks were always about moral behavior and a real heavy overload with Christianity and Christian ideas, about virtues and virtuous behavior. And I just actually read something in the Wall Street Journal the other day about children's literature, and just a historical perspective about when even cute illustrations appeared in children's books, and that really wasn't until about the 1930s. So when we think about hyperactive behavior or inattentive behavior in children, in the early 1900s, that was really just thought to be some kind of moral failing of the child's training or home training. It wasn't thought to be any kind of neurological disorder or something that the child couldn't control. It was really looked at as willful, wrong behavior. Well, we certainly have different ideas about that now. And it's also really interesting to note that it seems that there is not really very specific neurological evidence that exactly creates diagnostic criteria for ADHD. And so when you're reading this section of the chapter, I would suggest that you look a little carefully at this section. It does describe that, of course, they have done neurological studies on the brains of children who have ADHD, and they do see some anomalies in the brain functioning, either chemical processing or electrical processing, if you will, with having to do with the neurology of the brain. So they see differences, but the differences that they can see evidence of can also be found in what we would call normal, typically developing children who don't have ADHD. So that's intriguing to me. And actually, when I was searching for appropriate video clips for you, the one that I selected starts out by describing ADHD as a neurological disorder. And I took pause when I saw that in the YouTube clip, because I thought, well, that's kind of contrary to what our textbook states, really. So there is some disagreement in the field about whether this is an actual neurological disorder, like a physiological brain change that kids have. Another interesting piece of this is that it does seem to have a genetic component. And so whenever something runs through a family line, it does suggest some physiological basis for the disorder. And so that's all kind of just grist for the mill as we think about what ADHD is. It's not particularly well understood, but we do know that there are some very typical behaviors that children seem to exhibit. And on page 360 of your textbook, there's a little section called Noticeable Common Behaviors. And so here is where I would ask you to maybe stop my lecture and open up the short YouTube clip that is really about a young girl who, and it kind of contrasts two different children, a child who looks more typically developing, and then a child who has probably ADD, if it were my guess. And so stop the clip right now, my clip, and watch that one, and I think you'll see that that's just interesting to look at. As we return, I want to highlight just a few of the typical noticeable behaviors with children who have ADHD. One is that there are a bunch of them actually, and those are listed in a lot more detail on page 360. But they have difficulty staying on task, and on task is a phrase that I think teachers in the educational world uses, but it basically means that a child is sitting at their seat and they're doing their schoolwork, staying on that task. They're not getting up and running around, they're not disrupting their neighbors, they're not throwing things, they're not being overly playful or loud, they're not talking all the time. Staying on task is the absence of all of those kinds of behaviors. But all of those kinds of behaviors I just said are things that kids with ADHD might do. And so they have difficulty staying on task. They're often impulsive, sometimes impulsive in their behaviors, but also in their work habits at school. They don't listen for all of the instructions. They want to just get busy and start working on something or start playing a game. They're fidgety sometimes. They just go full steam ahead often. Sometimes this causes problems with their peers because they're impatient and they're impulsive. And they can sometimes be even quick to anger, although that is not something that is described in this textbook at all. And so these kinds of behaviors that I've just talked about are things that I'm sure you already know about, but they can really significantly affect the kids' school performance and also their social acceptance in their peer group. In terms of diagnostic categories, when a child is suspected of having ADHD, parents notice this behavior for sure, especially if they have other children in the home who are what we might call more typical. They will notice significantly the difference in this child in their home. And so, parents notice this kind of behavior, They may or may not want to do anything about it. They may hope that their child matures and grows out of some of these impulsivities and inabilities to sit still. But certainly by the time a child gets to school, these typical ADHD behaviors become quite evident because they're not really very helpful behaviors for being in a classroom. So, at some point, if the parents want it, a child will be tested and evaluated for ADHD. And so there are some diagnostic categories that can be outcomes of that diagnosis. The first one is what would be called combined presentation. And this is where a child has the ADD sort of side of the house, if you will, and the hyperactivity side of the house. And you probably know that these are two different families of behaviors. The ADD part is more the inattentiveness and the zoning out and the almost like not paying attention, or taking a while to respond to a question because they get distracted very easily. All of that is sort of the ADD family. The hyperactivity is that super high active level. So there is a type of ADHD which is the combined, where a child has both of those as a part of their behavior repertoire. Then there's the predominantly inattentive child who doesn't have the hyperactivity. They just have the difficulty attending to task and staying focused and remaining organized or getting organized. So the predominantly inattentive, difficulty sustaining attention, does not seem to listen, difficulty organizing and following directions, and being easily distracted. Those are just a sample of what that looks like. The predominantly hyperactive or impulsive side of the diagnosis is a child who is very, very, very noticeably on the move. Often these kids as toddlers are climbing all over everything all the time. They are sometimes loud, sometimes very vocal. They have trouble taking turns. They're just always on the move. So if you're in a classroom of 25 kids and you have one or two of these hyperactive children in the classroom, their behavior is very much noticeable. And I'm always assuming that you've seen children like this in your life. Some of you may not have been around children who are hyperactive like this, but when you're around one, you notice it because it's so very much more than the average kid. So those are the ways that a child might receive a diagnosis, a family might receive a diagnosis. The thing about all of this is that the criteria for the diagnosis is very subjective. So that means that it's not objective, such as does a child have difficulty breathing or not. That's really a yes or no answer. With ADHD, the criteria for deciding is this child, like what is overactive? Like where do you draw the line in terms of what is an overactive child to a degree that it's not typical? And so, one psychologist or evaluator might evaluate a child as having attention deficit, and the next person that the child sees or their classroom teacher might say, well, I don't really feel like it's that disruptive and not really that big a problem for your child's learning. So this is one of the interesting and complicating factors, I think, for parents who, might want an answer or might want to have help for their child. They might want their child to be qualified for special education services because their child is not doing well in school. And yet, as the child is evaluated, they might receive a diagnosis that is just falling short of being categorized as having this disorder. So that's interesting for you to think about, and I think as helpers, as you consider yourself maybe, somehow being around a parent like this, sometimes parents are very much searching for answers and want their child to receive a diagnosis so they can qualify for help. And sometimes parents are very resistant about receiving this diagnosis, and they don't want it on their child's record. They don't want their child to have a 504 plan or, to receive any kind of special education services. And this is really kind of true for a lot of the things that we've talked about in this class. Let me move on here. The prevalence, how many kids have this disorder. The interesting thing to me is that this has been, this diagnosis has been increasing in our culture. It's very common in boys, or very much more common in boys than it is in girls. So boys are 3 times more likely to receive this diagnosis, especially at a younger age. So maybe kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. Teachers are really noticing that this child is not able to sit still. They're eligible for special education under IDEA's other health impairments category, these children. And ADHD can also kind of appear in some other special needs that children might have. So in kids who have emotional disturbances, like maybe oppositional defiant disorder, they might also have the diagnosis for ADHD. Learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities also sometimes have this comorbidity or co-occurrence of ADHD. So that's interesting. With the emotional disability category, 58% of those children also have the diagnosis for ADHD. And for intellectual development, intellectually disabled children and learning disabled children, about 20% of those kids have also the diagnosis for ADHD. It's interesting to think about. How is this treated? How do we help kids with this? Well, obviously you know that children are medicated very frequently with when they have ADHD. And Ritalin is the most commonly used medication, but as you see in your textbook, there are several of these medications that are commonly used. You would recognize the, their commercial names as you look in the textbook. Excuse me. These medications are, in fact, very helpful for kids. 65 to 75% of children who are put on these medications respond quite positively to the medication's effects. And what you probably also know, if you don't, you should know, is that these are actually stimulants that are given to children. So it's interesting to think that, for a child who's already hyperactive, when they're given medication, it's a stimulant, and but the stimulant doesn't work that way. It has I can't think of the phrase I want to use, but it doesn't actually get metabolized for a child and become a stimulant for them. It gets metabolized and becomes what is more like a depressant, which slows the child down. And so the usual outcomes for children who are prescribed and take this medication is a reduction in the hyperactivity. They usually have an increase of settling down and being able to spend more time on task in the classroom. And they also have an increase in more acceptable classroom behaviors, which kind of also slides over into their peer behaviors, and they end up being able to play more appropriately with their peers once the medication is titrated to the right level. Sometimes as children are given these meds, it takes a while for the medication to start taking effect and to measure whether the child is over-medicated or under-medicated. And I remember once when I was doing an internship at a middle school, I was a substitute teacher at a middle school just when I first finished my master's degree. And there were a couple of kids in this school, in this classroom, who were so heavily medicated, it almost made them like a zombie. And I remember seeing that and making a note of it, because I hadn't actually been around children at that time who had ADHD and who were on meds. And it shocked me, actually, to see how zoned out some of these kids were. But then also, at the end of the school day, when their medication started wearing off, it was quite incredible to see the difference in their behaviors, kind of at the end of the school day when they really were finished, that dosage was wearing off. Let me just check the camera and make sure it's still running. Okay, yeah, we're still on. So last little bit I want to say about this is on page 363, there's a very interesting study with teachers where they gave the teachers this survey about main facts, true and false facts, questions that are associated with ADHD. And they measured how accurately teachers understood these facts about children with ADHD. And I was very surprised in this day and age that a large proportion of these teachers did not do well on this little quiz. And that is, if you're interested, I remember reading it out loud to my husband in the car because often when we're riding around somewhere for a long distance, I'll read my textbook. And so he and I talked about each one of these quiz questions. But one of the interesting ones that I thought that surprised me was that actually when children are given medications for ADHD, over the long term, it doesn't really seem to improve their school performance. But yet, teachers rate them as performing at a higher level and doing better in school. And my husband and I had a really interesting conversation about that, you know, just sort of wondering if the teacher, because of the behaviors that ADHD kids exhibit, don't really go along with the classroom setting. I mean, they're completely inconsistent with being in a classroom. And we wondered if teachers just rated these students higher because their behaviors were better and not necessarily because their performance on tasks was improved. So that's really an interesting little side note there about ADHD and medications and educational effects. So ADHD kids are treated through medication, we know that. And then also a really big part of it now is something called behaviorally based interventions. And this is where I started thinking about my stepson Avery, because when I knew him as a 5-year-old, I don't think they had any of these behavioral interventions. And these behaviorally based interventions are related to applied behavioral analysis, which you saw some samples of on YouTube when we were studying the autism chapter. And applied behavioral analysis is a very, 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 very nitpicky, specific analyzing of a child's behavior and then creating behavior plans that shape what behavior you really want to get out of the child. And you'll remember the reinforcement systems that were being used when we looked at those clips. If you want to revisit that, you can probably scroll back in our class and look for that video again if you're even curious about this. But these big behaviorally based interventions are very much sort of like self-monitoring. And so I don't want to make this sound too simple or simplified, but it's very much related to having the child, training the child to make note of their own level of paying attention. And so a child will have a little checklist, and at different times of the day they might have a small tone that will appear either in a little electronic device that tells them to, oh, notice, are you paying attention in class? Or notice, are you doing your math right now? And so the child then, when they hear this tone, they check their behavior, and then they make a little happy face or sad face in a box, and they're just recording at different times of the day, and not every 20 minutes exactly. It's really intervals are stretched out and compressed so that they're not looking at themselves at these very specific moments in the day. It's very randomized is what I mean to say. And so first you have to teach a child how to, notice themselves. And it would seem that for a kid who's having trouble with attention or having trouble sitting still, that this would be a hard thing to teach a child to do. But in fact, this behaviorally based intervention of rating themselves creates more long-term attention to task in schools. And so this is, I'm simplifying this, but there's a great example and description of it in your textbook. I thought I had a page reference for you on this. I guess I don't. But, this is really wonderful because it teaches self-regulation to these children who are very dysregulated in their attention and their ability to stay on task. Now, teachers, in addition to helping these children learn to regulate themselves, teachers also have to develop some flexibility in the classroom with these students. And so these students might be given the ability to get up and walk out of the classroom and go down the hall and shake it off a little bit. I remember my good friend Julie, who was the elementary school teacher that you met on Skype. I remember her talking about this, saying sometimes if I have a child who's having difficulty sitting still, I'll just say, Raul, why don't you get up and take yourself for a walk and then come back in and you can settle back down. And so with kids like this, another helping thing that a teacher can do in a classroom is give them smaller chunks of work to do and then let them do something different and then come back to another chunk of this classwork. So because you can't expect them to really sit still in the same way that typically developing children do. So I'm going to stop with that category and I'll make another clip.